Hello, dear friends. I'm excited to welcome you to the second part of a conversation between me and Richard Rohlin, which is a direct continuation of the pre-conversation we had a month ago. We talked about unity and multiplicity. We talked about Pentecost. We talked about Tower of Babel. We talked about the Leviathan. It was a fascinating conversation, and I invite you all to um, come and listen to it. And today, as promised, we are having a part two, which once again I'm excited to have. Welcome, Richard.
It's great to be back. Christos Voskresi.
Поистину воскресе. Yeah, so we're recording it after Easter, naturally. And actually, that's a great transition point because last time you promised that we will start our second conversation talking about St. Thomas, the twin. And we celebrated his feast a week
Mhm.
ago, not this Sunday, but the previous
That's right.
Sunday. And yeah, all on you, basically. So not to waste
Okay.
time, let's go.
Yeah, so St. Thomas is interesting because he of all of the missionaries of the early church, you could sort of argue that he's the one that goes the farthest. Now, there are certain apostles who seem to be, you could say, like apostles to the edge. They're apostles who go to the edge of the world. So St. Andrew, just as a quick example, is very famous example of this. St. Andrew, there are like medieval illustrations of St. Andrew like preaching to the dog-headed men,
Hmm.
and so on. Right. So um but St. Thomas is another one of those sort of apostles to the edge, or like the apostle to the extreme edge of the world. The some of the early missionary workings of St. Thomas are they're recorded in a they're recorded in an ancient Christian apocryphal document, which sometimes called the Acts of Thomas, and it is um, sometimes considered problematic. There are definitely, like many of these really old apocryphal writings, there are different redactions out there, and some of them are a little Gnostic. And of course, there's also very Gnostic redactions of the Gospel of Thomas, right? One sort of famous example. But the story itself, the core story itself, is has been received in the tradition. And so one of the things we were talking about was St. Thomas, the twin, right? He's called Thomas Didymus in the Gospels. So the sort of the question then is like, well, whose twin is he? Right? Whose twin is he? And it's funny because when I was in like evangelical Bible college and things like this, they would sort of speculate, oh, he must have just had a twin, right? He just had a twin, and maybe that's why he's not at the upper room. Maybe he's not there, because he's going to check on his brother or something like that. But the thing is, all of the apostles, they had family that they could have been checking on, but they're not. They're gathered in the upper room, we are told, for fear of the Jews, right? They're afraid. Well, Jesus just got it's simple to understand. Jesus was just crucified. And now they're going to be they're afraid that they're next, right? So the tradition of the church, and this is a very old, very early tradition in our in the Orthodox Church and in church history in general. The tradition of the church is that Saint Thomas was Christ's twin.
Hmm.
They actually he looks so much like Christ that you would sort of mistake them for each other. And this is why the apostles start to give him the nickname Didymus, the twin, right? The lookalike. So this is then kind of the sort of the theme of the writings, the apocryphal writings around Thomas and around his travels and his missionary journey. So as I think most people are aware, St. Thomas makes it to all the way to India, where he founds several early Christian communities. In fact, Christian communities in India now, Orthodox, Evangelical, Roman Catholic, all across the spectrum, very often refer to themselves as St. Thomas Christians because of this. So he makes it out to India, and while he's out there in India, there's sort of very famous stories of the things that he does, right? Famous stories of the things that he does, and a lot of them hinge on the fact that he looks like Christ, right? And so in some way, like he is Christ or sort of Christ's double. And so again, some people like make a big deal about this and say it's sort of Gnostic, where like Thomas is like the earthly Christ, and and then Christ is the
Ah,
heavenly Christ or something like this. But I think there's something deeper going on there. And it has to do with the way that the mission of the church goes to the ends of the earth, which is what Pentecost is about. So the story goes something like when St. Thomas is um, when he's at the it's after Pentecost and the disciples are beginning to kind of go to the different places around the world. And Christ actually sells Thomas into slavery.
mm,
Because God tells Thomas to go to, I know it's weird. God tells Thomas to go to India, tells him to go to India, right? And Thomas is like, well, how am I supposed to get there, right? So Christ says, don't worry about it. Come down to the docks and we'll find some passage. So they get down to the docks, and Christ actually sells St. Thomas to a slave trader, and the slave trader is the one who gets him to India. So then, Thomas has this whole journey, this whole trip, and he finally gets to India, and he gets sold to one of the kings there of
mm.
one of the tribes in India, and St. Thomas basically becomes like so. So there's that kind of let's say like an overlap or a
Parallel
what's the
to both Joseph kinda and
That's
Daniel.
exactly it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an overlap of trying to remember the word for this now. Um polyvalence, let's say.
Mm,
Like a polyvalence between Joseph and Christ and Thomas, right? Because Joseph is also a type of Christ, where he's
yeah.
actually one of the main ones in the Old Testament. Certainly that's how the church fathers saw it, right? So in the same way that Joseph is sold into slavery and then rises to this high position of trust, that's what Thomas does as well. And there are other parallels as well. So when Thomas gets to India, he rises to this high position of trust, and this king who's about to go away for a long time tells him, "Hey, why don't you I'm going to be gone for a long time. While I'm gone, why don't you build me a palace?" And Thomas says, "Yeah, no problem. I'll take care of it. I'm just going to need money for materials and all these different things." And so the king goes away on a journey, and he writes, a few months later, he writes back to Thomas and he says, "Hey, how's my new palace coming along?" He says, "It's going pretty well, Your Majesty. I just need a little more money for building materials." And he says, "Okay, well, you can have this money." And then writes him again, says, "How are things going?" And he says, "Oh, it's going fine, but I need money for the roof, and I need money for these pillars, and I need money for the throne, and like all these different things, right?" So the king keeps authorizing more and more money. And finally, many years later, he comes back. He comes back. And he comes back and finds that there's been no palace built at all. And he starts asking the other men of the court about this. And they basically say, no, Thomas has been giving all your money away to the poor. Well, the king gets really mad, and by some version of the story has Thomas, thrown in prison. And then in some versions of the story, the king like dies that night, or sometimes it's like his brother that dies. But basically, usually it's his brother dies, and is sort of resurrected by Saint Thomas. But like while his after his brother had died, he's being taken through the afterlife and being shown in heaven like all these great mansions, and he looks over at one massive really beautiful mansion, like this amazing gorgeous palace with the columns and the throne and the roof and like all these things. He says, "Man, whose place is that?" And whoever's guiding him through the afterlife says, "Well, that's your brother. That's for your brother, that Thomas built that for him." Right. And so then he, kind of wakes up. Sometimes the king has a dream, sometimes his brother dies and is raised. And anyway, the point is that this causes the king to like realize actually where his priorities are, and he converts and he becomes a citizen of the heavenly kingdom. This is just kind of one example. The other interesting thing about Thomas is kind of just a recurring trope of the way that he's always late to things. So famously in the story of the Dormition of the Mother of God, sometimes people call it the Feast of the Assumption, all of the apostles are brought by the Holy Spirit from the four corners of the world, all the different places that they've been ministering, and they're there at present at the repose of the Mother of God, except for Saint Thomas, who's still in India. And so after her burial, as her soul is departing this life and ascending up into heaven, St. Thomas shows up right then, and he says, "Where are you going, O Holy One?" I just got here. Where are you leaving? And so famously in one story, that's when she bestows her girdle upon him as a sort of like a parting gift, so that he won't be like without consolation. So so there's a lot of interesting things going on with Thomas. He's someday when I have some more time to think about it, I would like to uh, kind of look at the missionary journeys and the kind of the symbolism of each of the apostles and the ways that different early Christian communities tie themselves to one particular apostle. Obviously, Antioch and Rome both famously very attached to Saints Peter and Paul. Saint Andrew also, though, is one that really gets around. Obviously, for Constantinople, he's an important saint. For the Slavic peoples, he's an important saint, but also
Do you
for the
know about
Scottish.
interesting, because
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention about St. Andrew, according to Russian Orthodox
Mhm.
tradition, especially, like old Orthodox
Yeah,
tradition.
yeah, yeah,
Obviously,
yeah,
it
yeah.
went up the Dnieper River, and that's more or less people know. That's why he went, let's say, to the modern Kiev area, and that's
Right.
kind of where people mostly know the story today. But actually, according to the old tradition, it came even way further north. It came as far north as the Valam monastery. That's
Mhm.
currently it's north. Let me put it this way.
Yes. Yeah.
It's to the north of modern St. Petersburg. So he went up until that point and founded this first, let's say, proto-monastic communities, and that's how tradition goes. So
Yeah.
that's the community is way older, and that you mentioned that he is from the Scots. It's also
Yeah.
the,
I
guess,
don't
in a
know
way,
that.
apostle of the north in a way. So
Yeah.
the whole northern region,
The
as far
north,
north
and
as it
also
goes.
just places that are kind of on the extreme edge. Like it's
Yeah.
difficult to imagine being more on the edge of the world than somewhere like Valam or Scotland, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and even nowadays, so this Andrew Cross, it's on a flag of Russian Navy, for example, and
Yes.
even now, and it still kind of keeps on with the part of this tradition.
Right.
So it's interesting how this
Yeah.
original tradition is still in some state symbols even until now.
That's
Interesting.
right. Yeah, same thing. I mean, obviously St. Andrew's cross is the cross of the Kingdom of Scotland, and
Hmm.
it's interesting. So what I would like to do one day is to kind of like look at each of the apostles and kind of where they ministered and the way that these early communities kind of identified with them, tied themselves. But then you have other places that where the patronage of of one of the apostles becomes really important a long time after. So I mean, just for instance, the importance of Saint Mark in Venice, right? Obviously,
Hmm.
Saint Mark didn't die in Venice; he died in Alexandria. But at some point, they brought his relics back to Venice, and they're like, "Ah, Saint Mark, he's our patron now, along with all this other stuff we looted from Alexandria."
Yeah, that's a very
But
questionable story how
yes,
he ended up in
yes, yes,
Venice.
yes, yes. Yeah, but I mean, also like I'll just put it this way: a lot of relics ended up in Venice, suspiciously so. But yeah, I think that so to kind of tie that back into Pentecost, right? One of the elements of the icon of Pentecost, right, that you'll see is I wish I had an icon of Pentecost in here. Um, I've got one somewhere else in the house, but in an icon of Pentecost, you'll very often see this sort of door that's got a
Mm.
black background. And
Hmm.
then there's a figure standing in the door. And Jonathan Pageau's done a video about this a really long time ago. It's like, I think, one of his first videos that was really big. But so in very old icons, like sometimes you actually see a dog-headed figure in that door,
Hmm.
like but then in um in modern icons, usually it's sort of depicted as like an old man with a crown, and then he's holding in his like a sort of a towel or something, or a tray sometimes, and it's got all these scrolls on it, right? And then
Yes.
around this guy's head will be the word cosmos, which is his name,
Hmm.
right? So this is this is like a anthropomorphic representation of the cosmos, and the scrolls that he's holding are the words of the apostles, in other words, the gospel, right? And this is you could say it's like a visual representation of their sound has gone out into all the earth, and their sayings to the ends of the cosmos, right? Which is a line from the Psalms, which is originally about the stars and planets, but which the church applies to the apostles. Actually, the New Testament also applies it to the apostles, right? Which is the church, obviously. But you know, for instance, that's the if you go to church on one of the feasts of the Holy Apostles, that will be the prokumenon. Their sound has gone out into all the earth, and their sayings to the ends of the cosmos, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that the point of all this is to say that uh these saints like Saint Andrew and saints like Saint Thomas in particular are very closely connected to all that. And again, I'm just very interested in this idea is Thomas is sort of being the twin of Christ,
Hmm.
but then also like, sold into slavery by him, for this missionary work. And I mean, if you think about that, you can take the sort of the Gnostic associations
Hmm.
out of it and say, the focus is on the way that Christ, who is the king, makes himself a slave to the nations, right? And and this is even tied into the way that the Christian faith manifests, to kind of loop back around to talking
Unity
about
and
what all
multi.
of this has to do with like nationhood and all these different
Hmm.
things. The way the Christian faith manifests in different times and places, so that there can be such a thing as Russian Orthodoxy or even I mean
Antiochian Orthodoxy, Syrian
Antiochian Orthodoxy.
Orthodoxy. Yeah.
An example we really like to use here in the States is the way that the Orthodox faith was brought to the Aleutian Islanders in Alaska,
Hmm.
and because they weren't forced into the faith. And actually, many of them came to the faith despite the fact that so many Russians were taking advantage of them, right? Like this, like the fur traders and so on, like people treating them really, really poorly. And of course, that is why that's why Saint Herman and the other missionaries, that's why they came, is to look after these people. And it was the testimony of holiness that these men had, especially Saint Herman living among them, and them being able to see that this is a holy person, right? And so they came into the faith. They weren't forced into it, but they came into it in this organic way, and in this way that allowed them to preserve their sort of distinct cultural identities while also being Orthodox and also bringing in Russian things, right? Because that's the way the faith came to them. And this is an ongoing conversation that we seem to be constantly having in the Orthodox Church in North America, where
Hmm.
there are people, especially who are converts, converts from evangelicalism or from some other Western form of Christianity, and there's sometimes a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of anxiety about like, okay, well, when are we going to get like a real American Orthodoxy? It always comes down to tangible things like music, which I'm sympathetic to. Like, I like the idea that, we should eventually sort of figure out like what is, how do we do like Orthodox chant that's also American or something? And there have been some neat efforts made in this direction, which I like. There was a really beautiful one that somebody did for Holy Week this year, and it was kind of an Appalachian style chant, which is actually historically is tied very closely to like old Celtic, like still Christian, but like really old Celtic chant modes. That's where that comes from. And so in that sense, there is a connection that goes all the way back to the roots of the Christian faith in the West and even before the Great Schism and everything else. And so a lot of people are like, "Oh, this is really great. I think this is so beautiful. This is the music of my people, et cetera, et cetera." And then of course, there were a lot of people who are like, "Oh, this is no good. This is garbage because it's not the received tradition. Like you should be using Russian music, not this stuff, or you should be using Byzantine tones, not this stuff." But at some point, the Russian music was also new stuff and controversial, and there's a process. What I would say to people who are worried about this sort of thing is that you just have to give it some time. Like if we're going to be Orthodox, then we need to also function with an Orthodox scope of time where decisions sometimes take, decades or even centuries to be made, and problems take a long time to resolve. And it's better this way. It's better this way.
Well, I just want to build up upon it because I think
Yeah.
you actually managed to touch one of the key problem, not of just or not problem, but pattern of in not in just Orthodoxy, but also in Christianity as such. And it's kind of where actually the distinguishment between Christianity and Gnosticism comes in
Mhm.
a huge play. Uh, in the Acts, there is this very famous line when the disciples asks Lord, wilt thou at this time restore again the
Right.
kingdom to Israel? And he said unto them, it's not for you to know the times or
That's
the
right.
seasons. And I think that's actually one of the key, if you want, temptations like humans have after Christ, because it didn't really exist before Christ, because before Christ it was clearly more or less. It sucks. You go to the Hades, or if you're a superhero, maybe you kind of go into like uh, Elysium, but it's very small portion.
Sure.
But for most, it's just Hades. After Christ, it's clear that let's say eschatology. Basically, eschatology comes into the life of everyone, effectively, willingly or not. Doesn't matter whether you're Christian or not Christian, but eschatological thinking is becoming a paradigm of thinking, generally speaking. But the Christian answer is very counterintuitive to anybody. It's like, yes, it is eschatology, and even more like in the Revelation, we know very well how the eschatology is going to play out. But the exact times and seasons are not for you to know.
Right.
You need to let it kind of develop upon you, like through you, but not for you to know. And that's actually this anxiety is incredibly hard for within tradition and outside of the tradition. We know multiple examples of basically reforms, and we don't want to go too deep, and we can go into actually. It's a very interesting
Yeah,
topic
sure.
that we know that everybody knows the Reformation as the big Reformation of Martin Luther, etc., etc.,
Yeah.
etc. But in a way, the first great Reformation happened within the Catholic Church, with the great
Right.
popes of the 10th, of the 11th century, with Thomas Aquinas being kind of the biggest fruit of these reforms. But for 3 centuries, the great popes were trying to improve, like to improve the church around them, to reform, whereas and it achieved many great results. But then again, in 3 centuries, people became anxious again. Okay, there have been 3 centuries of great reforms, and yes, there are certain, let's say, successes, but then also like we see people are still not, in this ideal, perfect, holy condition which we're expecting them to become after these reforms. And
Right.
the next cycle of anxiety comes into play. And anxiety creates two ultimate ways out. Like you can argue that there are only two types of principal reactions out of anxiety outside of, let's say, it's either to double down, and here we see Luther, Reformation, so go really, really deep, or the second hand is humanism, which is also like, let's just focus on the secular time. Okay, we can't know anything about Revelation. Like it's kind of somewhere, some here, but we can't really know. So if we can't have it here and now, let's just put it aside, put it into bracket, and focus on what we can control. And that's kind of the two options you have when you can't incorporate this waiting. But again, it's not a passive waiting, and that's what I think is very cool in your example. The Christian waiting, the one which is at least we are called to do,
Yeah.
Orthodox waiting, is a like it's a metamorphical. So
Yes.
it's the waiting which is transforming you, and that's kind of actually counterintuitive. It was never super intuitive, I would say, to as a mainstream thought process, but it's even less counterintuitive for us nowadays when we want, okay, so that's my goal, that's my KPI, that's how I achieve it, how to, I cannot, you can't you can basically transform it into technology. And that's a
Yeah.
big challenge for our like time.
There's a this is actually what I've been thinking about all week. So I'm really glad that you mentioned reforms because there's something about the action of reform that always results in the sort of like the gathering of power. Right. Actually, Babel is a good example of this. Like you should think about Babel as a reform, like it's a reform movement, because what happens is humanity is scattered because of the flood, or humanity is destroyed because of the flood, right? But though, in other words, the world experiences chaos, right? This is chaos. And the thing that we want to avoid is being subject to chaos. If you want to go back to Hobbes, right, this is what Hobbes says is that there's no supreme good, but there is a supreme evil. And the supreme evil is the fear of violent death, right? And so, well, if we can't achieve the supreme good, in other words, we can't be saints, then we may as well try to make a stable political order, right? And as defined by a place where everybody is safe, right? And this is more or less this is what our society is accepted today. So Babel, they say let's reform things or let's reform things. In other words, let's rebuild the world. Well, how are we going to rebuild the world? Let's make a tower and a city. What's the tower going to do? It's going to protect us, but it's also going to, it's like you could say building an artificial mountain. So when the flood waters rise, in other words, when we experience chaos again, we'll all be safe and we can build a wall that will keep that out. Go ahead.
I just want to add again, there is this very important detail in the tower, and sorry for the sound. Obviously, that's when you need it to happen. But what they started to do before building towers, they actually starting to making bricks. And you can
Yes,
argue that it is an effective symbol of any technological process because
that's
people
right.
think bricks are intuitive thing nowadays. But if you ever been to Middle East, learning to make bricks, it's a gigantic technological step forward. Like,
That's
and
right.
the fact that they kind of making more or less what we use nowadays for roads, types of substance. So it's not just
Yeah.
bricks. Like, so they're collecting this power and they're collecting the power of material change over the world. It's happening in a parallel. So it's not just, yeah.
And there's an interesting detail in the Book of Jubilees that says that where they get the stuff like the bitumen that they're going to use for the mortar is that they're getting it from the sea. So, and the sea is, obviously in the story, the sea is chaos, right? So the idea is not just that we're developing technology, but it's like we're going to take chaos and we're going to use it to build a wall and a tower and to keep chaos out, right? And so that's the and so that's the reforming impulse. If you want to talk about Western Europe in the,
Any
let's say
reform, yeah, it's
let's
taking
say
the
let's
energy of
say
stasis
yeah.
and transforming it. Sorry,
So
continue, go on.
from so there's this long period of actually waves of reforms that begin, as you said, in about the 10th century, and then culminate obviously in the Protestant Reformation. Actually, it's not even really correct, I think, to talk about one Protestant Reformation because it was really a gathering of different movements, some of them quite opposed to each other. Um, and so so it begins in the early 10th century. There's something around the year 910. There's something called the Cluniac Reforms. I don't know if people are aware of this, but it's really actually quite important to understanding how the papacy emerges like it does over the 10th and the 11th century. And because basically the Cluniac reforms, which is the reforms within the Benedictine monasteries all across Western Europe, what basically happens is they say, oh, well, look, all of the normal clergy, I'm going to simplify a little bit, but all the normal clergy and the normal bishops and everything, they're super corrupt. And what we need is holiness. So we're going to do an end run around that. So like instead of like sort of fixing what's going on with the bishops, where you have situations like where you have bishops and those bishops have sons, maybe illegitimate sons, but they're like passing on the bishopric to their sons or to their nephews or whatever else. And so basically what happens with the Cluniac reforms is that they establish a monastery, a network of monasteries across Western Europe, which is not accountable to the local bishop, but is instead like this very powerful network that's under basically under an ordinary, like under somebody who's in charge of the whole network of monasteries, who's not a local bishop, right? And this allows them to get around the corrupt local structure. So it's building a tower, right? Allows them to get around the corrupt local structure. So the idea is now we're organized and we can be holy. But what happens as soon as you organize a big network like this, you start gathering power to yourself, and that usually power in the form of wealth and power in the forms of, in these other forms as well. But that
And more,
basically this,
and that changes very importantly is the understanding of monastic life, which
yes,
adds up. Like, so it's not about metamorphizing yourself, but it's about fulfilling a particular task. Many monastic orders are becoming, like, I like to actually use this metaphor, like in my some classes, that's a kind of, the space marines of church, like for people who like, so it's a battle brothers who just go into yes. So they kind of in a way becoming this. So for example, we have a specific task. For example, we have a problem with education. Let's have
yep.
Benedictines. We have a problem with Protestants. Let's set up Jesuits, etc. But you have a task, and for this task, you create effectively an arm of a state institution. So
That's
it
right.
is, and it's giving you a lot of power and
And
amazing examples of work. Yeah.
this is a sort of a weird aspect of Western Christianity to me. And to me, it's the thing that the development of all these different orders and confraternities in Western Christianity in the Middle Ages sort of like foreshadows the way that Protestantism will split into all these different denominations, where you're focused on like one particular thing, and so now you just sort of split off and you become your own church, right? And there was something like this already happening in the Middle Ages, starting with these waves of reforms, but eventually you have somebody like Francis of Assisi or people come along and they found the Franciscan order, the Dominican order, the Discalced Carmelite order, all these orders get founded, and then we say, oh no, this is not pure enough, so we need to split off now and found the Carthusians, and it goes on and on like this. And every time that they did this, what would end up happening. So it's a weird thing. If you read the history of, there's a book actually that people might be interested in. Hold on. I've just been reading it this week. So this is why this is on my mind. Um,
Wonderful.
it doesn't start quite this early, but it starts in about the 14th century. It's just called Reformations. It's by a guy named Carlos M. and Erie. Eire. Carlos Erie. And
Mm.
but he one of the interesting things that keeps happening, because he's talking about the sort of the Protestant Reformation and the like the early like, sort of proto-Protestant reformers, but also in tandem he's talking about all the reformations that are happening inside the Roman Catholic Church at the same time. And one of the weird things that happens is the way that anybody who's a reformer ends up becoming like a like really draconian totalitarian kind of dictator within their group once they reform it. And he says, so he'll give an example of, yeah, there was this group of monasteries, and there was this one person that tried really hard to reform them, and as a result, this group of and I don't know what the confessional commitments of the author, if any, are. I don't know anything, but he'll talk about it as like, oh, it's really bad that the Catholic Church had all this wealth and power. And so this group came along and they said, we want to get rid of all the wealth and power. So they organize and they build the tower. And then suddenly, and then he says, and because of this, they gained all this wealth and power and influence, kind of talking like, isn't that great? But the problem is that this creates this cycle of constantly trying to rebuild the tower, constantly this sort of like you try to construct something that's orderly, and then as you amass wealth and power to yourself, you get scattered, right? And so eventually the organization breaks down. The Protestant Reformation itself is a good example of this, right? Where it starts out as a single movement. We're trying to get away from the Catholic Church. We're trying to purify things back to what they thought. I believe genuinely at some point thought that this was more biblical. Now, I don't believe it was. Obviously, I used to be Protestant. I'm not anymore.
No,
But
but
genuinely
their
at the time,
motivations in the beginning, like it's
yeah,
pretty clear if you read,
right,
like, and if you read Martin Luther, that's also very important that he was a guy who effectively tried the way. So he tried as good as he can to follow, let's say,
yeah,
the instruction to
yeah.
holiness offered to him, and he was genuinely terrified, disappointed, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. So it's not like he just woke up with this wonderful way.
I mean,
Uh,
Luther's an interesting example because I like he's actually this whole Babel pattern on a micro scale, because he tries to like build the tower just in his own life. He's like, okay, I'm going to be a holy person. I'm going to get rid of all my sin. By his own account, Luther was going to confession multiple times a day. Now you sort of like imagine like your father confessor, your parish priest or whatever, like if you're going to him, like 3 or 4 times a day for confession, eventually he's going to tell you need medical help. Like, and I there's a part, I've always kind of suspected, nowadays we'd probably look at Luther and say maybe he had like bipolar disorder or something like this. But the point is like he really suffered from scrupulosity. So he tried to build the tower, and then his life fell apart. He experiences this scattering, and then he says, "Oh, it's the church's fault. I've got to reform the church." And so he starts to build the tower again. And then with the Protestant Reformation kicks off again, like almost immediately, there's a scattering. There's a Tower of Babel moment where almost immediately we go from fighting the Pope and fighting the Roman Catholic Church to fighting each other, as all these different Reformation leaders sort of split off, and you've got Luther's doing one thing, and Calvin's doing another thing, and Zwingli's doing another thing, and they can't agree on the Eucharist, and they can't agree on actually what books should be in the Bible. They can't agree on the most fundamental things in the Catholic faith. And then another generation, and you have like the Anabaptists coming along, and they're changing the definition of marriage, and they're changing all these different things, and it's this real scattering that sort of happens. That is very much, I think, that sort of shape of the Tower of Babel. And one of the interesting things is that I think sort of comes about, and this wasn't Luther and Calvin's generation, but this comes along sort of later, is this idea, well, I guess we tried to make everybody a saint. I mean, this is the project of Calvin's Geneva, or some of the Calvinist cities, the Reformed cities in the Netherlands, right? Where the idea is we're going to force everyone to live in a certain way so that they can become a saint. So then it's like, instead of reforming a monastery where at least people are here more or less voluntarily, right? And they've all agreed on a certain rule of life and everything else. Well, with built when Calvin started building Geneva, like trying to make it this, like the perfect Christian city, right? It got to the point where, by one account, there were people whose job it was to like check and see how many spoons you owned, right? Like in other words, like how much silverware do you have? Like back when silverware was actually silver, right? So to check and see like how many spoons, how many forks, how many knives, to make sure that you weren't like accumulating wealth to yourself that would put you over somebody else in the community, right? So it gets to be like a little draconian. And now those places are the most secular places in the world.
And it actually makes total sense. Sorry again for suffering the sound, but
Yep.
I think it's coming actually connected back to Gobson one important element, as I write in the article I sent you. He had a very particular understanding of what a human is. And that's
Yeah.
actually, I think, kind of connects it all together. He calls it a person. And in English, person is just normal word. We use it every day. But it's actually coming from Greek prosopon, the mask.
Yeah.
And we can argue that it's the mask which is the social. Like, and we all wear the mask. You can say that you wear the mask when you work for your boss, when you are, in a way, when you are talking to me, like it's different social roles and actors. But where Gobs was crucial, and that's what I think is the point, he kind of narrowed down for the whole of human, the whole of an individual to this mask. And then it becomes clear if all we are is the mask, and that's actually very con- contingent with this whole legal way of thinking about life, let's say jurisprudential, like so, like, and if we understand, for example, the confession in a legal way, that's also like, let's say my mask is confessing, let's say I broke the law, I need to confess, then it naturally is that you want to make it hard. Like obviously, like then you want all the masks to be good because how else could it be? Because then if one of your masks, it changes the purity of the whole structure. Whereas if you consider more, let's say, and where like it's definitely Orthodox tradition, Orthodox understanding, but I would argue Christian general tradition, which we are called to, we argue that no mask is enough to describe person. There is this mystery of inner life. And this mystery can, in principle, not be touched by any structure, by any reform, by any like external forces. It can be only be transformed through Christ and through within. Like, but it's always this organic process of waiting, and there is no deadline. Like, it's not a timetable. Like, the salvation train doesn't come on a schedule, if you want, like effectively as a metaphor. But then it definitely changes almost expectations. Then you can leave the room for impurity in a social structure, in a social system. You don't have to ultimately to build a tower because there is no, basically, you personally won't be late, let's say, to be saved in a way. So you can leave time for it. Do you see what I mean? I think it actually comes to the core understanding of our whole,
So
what we mean to be a person. What is it? Is it just the sum of our social relations, or is it something which can never be put even into on a scale except by, let's say, the heart? Like in Orthodox tradition, we call it about as the heart. Nobody knows the depths of the heart. What is the heart,
right.
etc., etc., etc.
I mean, all of this, I was actually thinking this even before you said this. So again, we're tracking, we're on the right path here, I think. All of this for me really sort of highlights the importance in our tradition of Saint Gregory of Palamas and his life and the writings that he left and the but even his homilies, like even his homilies directed at lay people. Um, for people who aren't aware, Saint Gregory essentially defended the Orthodox faith against humanism, right? So you've got Barlaam, who's he is a monk. He's an Orthodox monk, but he's a very sort of worldly or like very humanistic monk. He's steeped in Greek philosophy and kind of secular learning and everything. And he goes to Mount Athos and here's all these Orthodox monks there praying the Jesus prayer, and they don't have any of the education that Barlaam has. And he basically, I mean, he calls them navel gazers. That's the epithet that he uses for them, and basically says this is a huge waste of time. What you should be focusing on is education. And it's basically the statement, right, that I was mentioning a moment ago, right? The kind of the idea of, I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but let's say like just like the worst examples of humanism, right? And to go back to Hobbes as a for instance, right? To say that, well, you can't ever be like totally holy in this life. So you may as well not try, right? You may as well instead like focus on just like making human life as good as human life can be, right? And the idea that Saint Gregory is defending against Barlaam, among other things, and again, this is very complicated stuff, a lot of technical reading if you want to get into this, but what he's really defending actually is first of all what you just said about the hiddenness of the heart, and that is true both for us, but it's also true for God, right? And God, you're not going to find God uh, through philosophical training or human learning. And it's not to say that a lot of people haven't. What I mean by this is to say is that, if you read a bunch of books and you do a lot of philosophical training, and then one day you sort of wake up and you realize, oh, the thing I've been actually looking forward for this entire time has been God, and to know God and to have a relationship with Him, right? Well, He's revealed Himself to you. Now, He might have used all of these other things, but these things didn't reveal God to you. God revealed God to you, and this is the only way. And so God's heart, his essence, I mean, this is the whole idea. His essence is unknowable, right? But also the essence of each, but our essence is unknowable. Like the human heart, like who we are and what we are is unknowable. But I know you through the relationship that I have, right? But also I have to understand that there's always a little bit of a gap there between that. And the more perfectly we live into that relationship, the more perfectly we live into that relationship, the better I know you. But with God, He has the capacity, let's say, to reveal himself, and this is through his divine energies, but to reveal himself, sort of directly to the human heart in this actually in an unmediated way, because this is the crux of the argument, is that the energies of God are not they're not a mediated, they are God Himself. They are God Himself. That's what I'm trying to say. So the question becomes a sort of a question about the
And
knowability of
sorry, and
God.
notice,
Yes,
and
go
that's
ahead.
exactly that solves the problem which we're talking about, the problem of anxiety, because that's another
Yeah,
metaphor. Basically, what Saint Palam argues, it's like you can know God not as an abstract concept, but
that's right.
effectively you can feel like, you think he uses as a metaphor of a sun, and one day, and energy
Mhm.
effectively is the warmth of the sun, so you can actually stand in this sun and feel it,
Right.
like, but not just sensually feel it. Again, yeah, technical terms,
Yeah.
how exactly this feeling happens.
Yeah.
But, and we can argue, so what? Why does it matter? But that's kind of the crux of the argument of the whole medieval time. It was a principal
Yeah.
question because, for example, alternatively, you have people falling into despair. If you read Petrarca of the same time,
Oh yeah.
he is in despair because whatever I do, I'm not good enough to know God, and what's the point? Like, and that's a very real issue. And you can, if you, for nowadays, you can say perfection. Like, whatever we do, we're never good enough for this perfect image, whatever we
Right.
put into our head.
Right.
So what do we do? How can we live with this anxiety? So it is a very, it's the same problem. It's the same pattern developing in different
Yeah.
areas.
Yeah. It matters because, and this is how it ties back to Babel, and this is how it ties back to everything we've talked about last time and this time. It matters because the question is like, what's the telos of the human being? Like, what's the thing that you're made for as a human being? And what St. Gregory says, and what St. Paul says, and what the church has always sort of maintained is that the thing you're made for is union with God, right? To not just know things about God, but to really know God, right? And basically what Barlam was arguing for is this idea that you can only ever know about God, right? So pursue philosophical learning, pursue education, pursue theological learning. That's all fine, but don't think that because you're sitting on a mountain in a monastery saying the Jesus prayer and you're seeing, the uncreated light and all these things. Don't think you have more of an experience with God than I do, that kind of a thing. But then like I mean, Barlam is the one who taught Petrarch Greek. Like these guys were really connected, right? Um, and this, and so there's this idea that, well, once you abandon the idea that the thing your life is for is actually to know God, then all you're really left with, that there's no, summum bonum, all you're really left with is to say, well, how can I just make human life as great as it can possibly be? And reform is always a really important part of that, right? And it's not to say there's not like a good way to go about reform. Actually, one of my favorite examples of a reform controversy is, I'm sure you're familiar with the possessor controversy in Russian Orthodox history. Yeah. So it's
Yeah, sure.
basically, what's that?
Yeah, sure. In Russian, it's called нестяжатели, like Иосифляне и
Yeah.
нестяжатели, to
Yeah,
say.
like the possessor non-possessor controversy is usually how it's translated in English. And basically it's an argument between the successors of Saint Sergius of Rodanch about or how do you say that word, by the way? Is it Rodanch, Rodanesh? I
Радонеж.
Rodon
Сергий
Rodanesh.
Радонежский. Yeah.
Rodanesh. Okay, I hear people in English say it all kinds of ways. And Russian is not a language that I know very well. Although I think I found somebody to teach me finally. So
Is
maybe
it by
one of
chance
these.
Nicholas?
No, 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 no. Somebody here in my community here in Texas, but I'm hoping so maybe someday. No promises, guys, but maybe someday we do these conversations in Russian. That would be amazing.
If you need any practice, just let me know.
Ah, that would be great. That would be great. Yeah. So anyway, so Saint Sergius's his successors, there's kind of an argument about, well, should we build our monasteries in the cities so that we can look after the poor and do all these things? But also that means, by the way, you have to own property, right? You have to own property, and which means you have to have somebody administrate it, and then you start building wealth and all the problems that come with that. Or do we live off in the woods somewhere and just pray? And the amazing thing about the Orthodox Church is that we canonized both of these guys. We canonized them both. And to me, that's just always just kind of an amazing something that's very hard for a Western mind to grasp, but something I've really come to appreciate in the Orthodox Church is that the answer is usually both and. Usually if you find yourself in a kind of a either or place, and this is the problem with every reformer in uh this is the problem with every reformer in Western history is that they're usually people who can only see things one way, right? And they're because they're fixated, like they can only see things in this one particular way. So Luther says, no, it's got to be all grace. Why? Because I already tried and I failed. So if I failed, obviously everybody has failed, right? So it can only be grace. It's got to be all grace, right? So they can only see things in one particular way. And that's the building the tower. That's when you get scattered.
It's this is very wonderful that you said it. I just wanted to add, like, speaking about reforms, because like Russia has its own, even in church example of a pretty bad reform, and it happened later in 17th
Yes, yes, yes,
century.
yes.
And I would argue that's the wound which is kind of, if you want to understand Russian history, you need to understand the 17th century. Like, and that's just it's a topic for another conversation. It's kind of
Yes,
how
yes,
to do
yes.
things the wrong way.
Yes.
How to do the things the right way, though, like in both of these guys, both Nistijateli and like possessors, non-possessors, because possessors kind of they were also building up on part of a tradition which starts with Moscow metropolits. For example, the Holy Metropolite of Alexei of Moscow, who
Hmm.
is in fact, you can argue, the creator of Moscow state, like in a way, like not maybe from legal perspective, but he played a huge role. But I would argue that the key difference for us to notice here, and it's a very broad speaking, is the different principle. How would I distinguish between good reform and bad reform? Good reform seeks only to effectively become a rock. Doesn't matter whether you're in a forest or doesn't matter whether you're in a city. And then around this reform, kind of certain radiating light is happening, or some movement is starting to happen. And then the metamorphical transformation of a place around this rock is happening. Whereas bad reform always tries to go to the place, to collect the place, and to build the tower. And that's exactly the difference. The problem is the second one pass is much clearer. You can build expectations, you can have program. It's very, very clear. The first reform is way less tangible, it's way less predictable, it's way less
Yeah.
yeah, you can't put it into timetables. That's what makes it much, much harder. But the change is that within its path, you keep the core issue where the core phenomenon, which I think the whole Orthodoxy and Christianity is based on, the problem of a subject. It puts
No.
a subject as an individual, not separated, but as a precisely agent, you can even argue, into the center. And you leave it its freedom to be transformed, to be like, you don't even have to tolerate. That's another cool element, which often like another going into the wrong direction is would say, okay, so if this is all happens, let's just not be clear about anything. Okay, if any attempt to build something creates in a tower, so let's not just build anything or let not be clear in anything. But it's also a wrong way. You can be clear, and like let's say all the monks were very clear, like all fathers were very clear. Maximus the Confessor was so clear, he was he had a very difficult life because of his clarity. But he didn't try, let's say, to
Yeah.
go and start a revolution.
Yeah.
That's the difference. I mean, so you can be as clear in your agency and as clear in your uh, being an acting subject, but you're almost realistic about the extent you can invoke change in ourselves. You leave it to them to invoke change in
Yeah.
ourselves.
And very importantly, when this goes well, it goes well because there's a holy person at its center, right? Who's holding things together, who's become. There's a phrase used about Saint Seraphim of Sarov, which I just really love, that he was totally transparent to Jesus Christ, right? So if you have a holy person at center, even if, I mean, and holy does not mean the same thing as polite. There are famously some saints who were maybe not people you'd want to have over for dinner, but to have a holy person, a person who's totally transparent to Jesus Christ in the time and place where God has put them, in the way that they're supposed to be, then when a reform happens around them, it carries the authority, but it's the authority of Christ. It's the authority of holiness, and it's not the authority of a top-down structure that somebody like rigidly, I mean, to think of like another monastic reformer, right? Saint Basil the Great, who literally, if you're Orthodox, wrote the book on monasticism. I mean, literally the book, right? Um, Saint Basil the Great, and we don't have another kind of monasticism in the Orthodox Church. Like we don't have orders, we don't have, any of those things. It's just sort of like we just sort of follow the pattern of life, the rule of life that Saint Basil and obviously others, the Egyptian desert, that inheritance as well. But the but the things that he wrote, right? And the legacy that he left continues to be with us today because of this sort of the authority of his holy life and the saint that he was, the holy person that he was, and obviously somebody that got had an extraordinary, number of natural talents, right? A gift for all these different things. It uses those things for the kingdom of God. But he's still, at the end of the day, the most important thing about him is that he was a saint, right? He was a saint, um, and then sometimes also, they kill you first, right? Or they exile you first. Another great reformer, Saint John Chrysostom, you know, uh, was exiled, died in exile, before people started, really listening to him and taking him seriously sometimes. And so, anyway, and there are many other such cases, but I think this is the other thing, is that something that really seems to me, and I don't want to be uncharitable to people, especially the dead, but something that really seems to me to characterize many of the reformers, just as I'm kind of reading back through, this book I'm reading right now is really the first time that I mean, I used to study and teach about the Reformation all the time as an evangelical. This is really the first time I'm revisiting it after many years of being Orthodox. And the thing that seems to really characterize these men as opposed to the saints, right, is a really just a lack of humility, right? A lack of a willingness to sort of submit themselves to a higher authority, right? Especially, when Luther goes and he starts deciding which books are in the Bible and aren't, or starts deciding like which parts of tradition do I keep or don't, right? And he just sort of says, well, I'm the one that decides, right? And
Which is
it's
in effect like a temptation we all have, because
oh
that's
yeah,
like we really like, I like this part of tradition, I like this part of
that's right.
scripture, this one I don't really like, so let's, whereas the goal is,
Yeah,
and it is hard, it's a very difficult labor, we need to admit,
yeah,
like, because for every, let's say, citation from a Bible, you have a different, like, opposite
that's
citation
right.
from a Bible.
That's right.
It creates an enormous freedom of you to, let's say, pick up whatever you want, and you can build very
That's right.
different interpretations which can technically be reliable upon the same scripture. And but the job is to integrate everything, to accept it as a like wholesomely, and that's a hard job to do. And like, so I just, again, so you said you wanted to be charitable to these people, so I think,
Yeah.
yeah, every time we
Yeah.
look in a mirror we can see the same in us,
Well,
so
I
it's
mean, this
very
is the thing. I'm
understandable.
not I'm not saying that I'm a humble person. And I mean, this is part of like I'm so for I mean, people who don't know, I was a Protestant minister before we came to the Orthodox Church. And one of the things that, when we left, everybody asked us, "So are you going to start your own church? Like, this is what you do in the world that I came from. If you're not happy with things at your current church, you're supposed to leave and start a new one, right? And this is just what you do. And so everybody assumed, they asked us, oh, well, let us know when you start your new church and things like this. And I was like, no, no, no. I'm never starting any churches ever again. Like I'm just, I've got to go somewhere that's been there, that's older than me, right? You know, I know too much about myself to want to be a part of any church that I start, and yeah, and so that's the thing. Like it's just uh we have to have humility, we have to be patient, and I think it's really also really important to kind of just be able to kind of see yourself with some distance and perspective. The thing that ties together humanism and all the big reform movements of the 15th and 16th centuries and all that stuff is a shortening of perspective, right? Where people are like, no, I've got the answer now. Boy, wait till you guys hear. Like I've got the solution for this problem. And there's something like, especially as Americans, there's something daring about that appeals to us because
Oh
like
yeah, I
we're
mean because yours
yeah,
in your world and you're above
that's
history,
right. That's
ultimately.
right. That's
Like
right.
history doesn't matter. Like it's
That's right.
for these European freaks. We are beyond the laws of history.
And this is why we don't understand why, and this is why Americans don't understand why people in Europe can't get their crap together. It's like, come on, guys. We've already solved all of the world's problems. Look how great we have it. Why can't you guys just get on board with the program?
But the same pattern, if you notice, like you say about this whole live and start your own church, the same if you notice the pattern of state creation, exactly the same
Oh
pattern.
yeah.
I don't like the state. Okay, let's move to the free land and build my own state. Like
Yes.
it is. I agree. Like for American, if you can argue, it is an effect now in American tradition or American pattern. It has this huge element of here and now and then. But you're absolutely right. It is about. I just wanted to notice that where the trick happens. That after you can argue, okay, it's all religious mumble jumble. So what you religious people are talking about? But after the God, let's say, with secularism, for many people was put behind the equation, the very same pattern is now playing with the state. We expect now just not the church to create the heaven and earth, but the state to create on heaven and earth, and ideally
That's
within the
right.
next 5 years. Like ideally with these guys who win the election, we want him to create literally heaven and earth within the next 4 years. If he doesn't,
Yes.
he's not good enough. Maybe 4 years is too much. Ideally, immediately, the next night he is elected.
And it's one of the things that, I mean, this is why I kind of got really tired with American politics. I grew up in a very like politically active family, had worked on different campaigns and things like that when I was young. And but just like I at some point I realized like the cycle is impossible. There is no way that you can affect meaningful change in a country of 300 million people. 300 million people. Like the Romans couldn't do it and they had like a tenth of our population. Like there's no way that you can affect meaningful change in a country of 300 million people in a 4-year cycle. Like that's complete nonsense. You couldn't do it in 4 generations. And
But you cannot not expect. But the whole pattern of expectation is already so deeply
right,
ingrained that we
right.
don't realize where it's coming from, but it kind of almost rules over us. That's, I
Yeah.
think, one of the most fascinating pattern. I just wanted then to finish like as an opposite. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
do you know like Nikolai Berdyaev as a philosopher?
No.
He's a really good Russian, like strong Russian philosopher of the 20th century, and has a quote which I really love, which kind of distinguishes, in my opinion, the Gnostic approach to the state and powers
Mm.
with like more skeptical and realistic. Which here he says that the purpose of the state is not to create a heaven on earth, but just let it not to dissolve in hell immediately. Like so, like
Yeah.
and I think it is just this changing of an optic and changing of expectations. It's also very, to me, characteristic that people talk about freedom all the time. And again, it's topic hopefully we will have after you will have like back in August or in September, because I would want to
Yeah.
continue it. That we're so rooting for freedom, but at the same time we expect something external to give us this freedom
Yes.
and to create it on our behalf, which is also kind of almost a paradox. Like because if you really that much into freedom, and I agree, as a Christians we are all very much into freedom, just it's the freedom to transform yourself, and this freedom is specifically not from the state. Like no state, no president, no like can give you this particular freedom, and that is the freedom which you actually seek. So it is very paradoxical, and like as you, I know in Jonathan's circle you call it the clown world, and I think it's a very accurate description how all of the ideas are intertwined to be almost a mockery of what they used to be, but still repeating the same pattern, which is also very fascinating. Oh, okay. So yeah, I guess we're wrapping up. So again, thank you for amazing conversation. Again, I'm very grateful for your time. I
Thank
hope we
you. I
will have
mean,
more in the
I
future.
definitely do want to. I've got a bunch of travel coming up, but when I get back, I would love to talk some more. Um, and your
Totally.
audience, thanks to your audience. You guys don't know how hard it has been to nail me down for conversation. Pavel's been very, very patient. So anyway, thanks to him
No,
and thanks to you all. You're very kind to have me on. Thank you very much.
thank you. Okay, guys. Then yeah, subscribe to. No, actually, Richard doesn't have a channel, so don't subscribe to the channel. He doesn't.
Yeah, yeah, don't I actually so I have a YouTube channel that I don't post anything on. I really studiously try to avoid having my own channel because there's just too much I've got too many other things to do and I feel like if I had to do what you do or like what Jonathan does, like Jonathan has like, 3 videos a week or something, I would just lose my mind. Like so I'm very happy just to have
I
cool
try to
friends
limit
and
to
come
one a
talk with
week.
them.
Like
Yeah.
that's three is too much. But I know you're working on several really cool projects. So
Yes.
like once you put them into like process, I will also post links to them
Yeah. Yeah.
later.
And
But yeah,
we can talk about those as well. I mean, everything that I'm doing right now is pretty much going to be coming out through Symbolic World Press. I still have a couple of projects that I'm doing with Ancient Faith, but most of the projects that I'll be doing in the future will be through Symbolic World Press. So people can go watch there for all that and come and find me on places like this. So
okay. Then thanks again, and Christos Voskresie.
voice was crazy.